Today, there are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. We're everywhere. Cities, farms, mountains, deserts. We've built skyscrapers, sent rockets to Mars, created the internet. We dominate this planet like no species ever has. However, if you had looked at the world 70,000 years ago, the picture would have been shockingly different. There were barely 1,000 humans left alive on the entire planet. Not 1 million, not 100,000, just around 1,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals. That's it. The entire future of humanity hanging by a thread so thin, it's almost impossible to believe we're here today. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time. I check comments and it's like Tokyo at midnight, Toronto at dawn, all at once. You know that feeling when you realize how close you came to disaster? Like when you slam on the brakes and miss that truck by inches. That moment when time seems to slow down and you realize you almost died? That's what happened to our entire species. Except it wasn't a split second, it was thousands of years of barely hanging on. And here's the really crazy part. This wasn't some distant evolutionary event from millions of years ago. This was 70,000 years ago. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, people who looked exactly like us, people with the same brain capacity we have today, people who could walk, talk, think, and feel just like we do. If you could somehow travel back in time and bring one of them forward to today, dress them in modern clothes, they could walk past you on the street and you wouldn't notice anything unusual. Those people nearly went extinct. See, scientists had been puzzling over a mystery for decades. Our genetic diversity is weirdly low, like suspiciously, unnaturally low compared to what we'd expect for a species with 8 billion members spread across every continent. Take chimpanzees who live in small scattered groups across Central and Western Africa. Despite having a total population of maybe 300,000 today, they have way more genetic variation than all 8 billion humans combined. You can take 2 chimpanzees from the same forest, and they'll be more genetically different from each other than a person from Norway is from a person from Japan. That's not normal. That's not how populations are supposed to work. That's the signature of something catastrophic happening in the past. But nobody knew exactly what that catastrophe was. Nobody knew it was so recent. Nobody knew it brought us within a hair's breadth of total extinction. Nobody knew that every person alive today descends from a group of survivors so small they could have fit inside a modern high school gymnasium. The story starts with volcanoes, not just any volcano, not even a regular supervolcano, the biggest volcanic event humanity has ever witnessed as a species, and probably the most catastrophic natural disaster modern humans have experienced in our entire 300,000-year existence. Around 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba, in what is now Sumatra, Indonesia, exploded with a violence that makes every modern volcanic eruption look like a firecracker by comparison. Mount St. Helens in 1980, Krakatoa in 1883, Mount Vesuvius destroying Pompeii, child's play compared to Toba. This wasn't a volcano in the sense most people think of volcanoes, with lava flows and ash clouds. This was a supervolcano, a geological monster that had been building pressure beneath the Earth's surface for hundreds of thousands of years, accumulating magma in a chamber the size of a mountain range. And when it finally blew, it nearly took humanity with it. Picture the explosion. Actually, you probably can't. The human brain isn't really equipped to comprehend destruction on this scale. Our evolutionary history prepared us to understand threats like predators or falls or starvation, but not geological catastrophes that reshape entire continents. But try anyway. The blast was heard thousands of miles away. Some geological estimates suggest the explosion was equivalent to 10,000 Hiroshima bombs going off simultaneously. Others suggest it was even larger, perhaps 100,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The sound alone would have been loud enough to rupture eardrums hundreds of kilometers away. Ash shot 50 kilometers straight up into the atmosphere, punching through the troposphere, through the stratosphere, reaching heights where the air is so thin you can't breathe, and temperatures swing from baking hot in sunlight to far below freezing in shadow. The eruption column, a pillar of superheated ash and gas rising into the sky like a tower from hell, was visible from the Indian subcontinent over 3,000 kilometers away. People living in what is now India and Pakistan would have seen it on the horizon, a black column reaching into space, blotting out the sun. Within hours, pyroclastic flows were racing across the landscape at hundreds of miles per hour. These aren't flows of lava, which are relatively slow and can sometimes be avoided. Pyroclastic flows are avalanches of superheated gas and pulverized rock, moving at speeds that make escape impossible, at temperatures hot enough to instantly vaporize anything organic. Trees that had stood for centuries were gone in seconds, not knocked down, but completely incinerated. Animals were killed so quickly they didn't have time to run, their bodies buried and baked into the ash layers. Entire ecosystems, everything within hundreds of kilometers of the eruption, were simply erased from existence. But that was just the immediate destruction. That was just the opening act. The real damage, the thing that nearly ended humanity forever, came from what happened next. When Toba erupted, it ejected something like 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash and rock into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, that actually makes sense. That's enough material to bury the entire state of Texas under 15 feet of volcanic debris. Mount St. Helens, which people still talk about as a major eruption, which was considered a significant geological event, ejected about 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba ejected 2,800 times more than that. It's not even the same category of event. It's like comparing a firecracker to a nuclear weapon, but most of that ash didn't fall immediately back to Earth in the regions surrounding the volcano. A huge portion of it stayed up there, suspended in the upper atmosphere, caught in jet streams and high-altitude wind patterns, spreading on atmospheric currents, circling the globe, forming a blanket of fine particles that wrapped around the entire planet like a funeral shroud. And that blanket blocked out the sun. Not completely, not everywhere. The world didn't go dark like in some apocalypse movie, but enough sunlight was blocked to matter, more than enough to drop global temperatures by somewhere between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius on average, according to most estimates. Some regions, particularly in the northern hemisphere, experienced drops of 10 to 15 degrees, enough to trigger what scientists call a volcanic winter. A period when the entire planet's climate goes completely haywire because adequate sunlight can't reach the surface to drive normal weather patterns and biological processes. Think about what that means for a moment. Really think about it. Plants need sunlight for photosynthesis. That's not optional. That's not something they can work around. Without adequate sunlight, plants don't just grow more slowly. They die. Leaves fall off. Growth stops. Seeds fail to germinate. Entire forests can die back to bare branches and dead trunks. When plants die, herbivores have nothing to eat. The animals that depend on grazing or browsing, that need fresh plant growth to survive, they start dying too. First, the young and the weak, then the healthy adults, as they exhaust their fat reserves and find nothing to replace them. When herbivores die, predators and scavengers have nothing to hunt or scavenge. The carnivores that depend on healthy prey populations, they starve next. The whole food chain collapses from the bottom up, each level failing as the level below it disappears. And humans, sitting near the top of that food chain, dependent on both plant foods for carbohydrates and vitamins and animal foods for protein and fat, were about to face a crisis unlike anything our species had experienced before or has experienced since. Enough to kill most of the plants humans depended on for food, enough to devastate animal populations across multiple continents, enough to make survival almost impossible for a species that was already struggling to maintain stable populations across Africa and parts of Asia. And here's the thing, people don't always understand about prehistoric humans, about our ancestors 70,000 years ago. We weren't like we are today. We didn't have the technologies and social structures that make modern human life possible. We didn't have agriculture, which means we couldn't grow our own food, couldn't plant crops and wait for harvests. We didn't have animal husbandry, which means we couldn't raise livestock, couldn't maintain herds of cattle or flocks of sheep or goats that we controlled and could slaughter when needed. We didn't have permanent settlements with stored food reserves that could carry us through lean times. We didn't have granaries full of grain or smoke houses full of preserved meat. We didn't have complex trade networks that could move resources from abundant regions to scarce ones, that could buffer localized shortages with surpluses from elsewhere. We were hunter-gatherers, living day to day, week to week, season to season, dependent on finding enough wild food each day to survive until tomorrow. Our entire existence was based on the natural abundance of wild plants and wild animals that we could gather or hunt. When Toba erupted and the volcanic winter set in, that natural abundance vanished almost overnight, and we had no backup plan, no stored food, no alternative food sources, no safety net of any kind. The ashfall was catastrophic beyond description. In South and Southeast Asia, the regions closest to the eruption, layers of ash several meters thick covered the landscape. In some locations, ash deposits over 6 meters deep have been found, compressed now after 74,000 years, but originally even deeper. Imagine trying to survive when everything you know, every landmark you use to navigate, every familiar place, every resource location is buried under meters of grey volcanic ash. Everything is the same colour, the same texture, the same dead grey landscape extending in all directions. No plants growing through it because the ash is too thick and too sterile. No animals to hunt because the animals have nothing to eat and have either died or migrated to distant regions that weren't as badly affected. Water sources contaminated with ash that turns into a cement-like substance when it gets wet, clogging rivers and streams, making water dangerous to drink. The air thick with fine particles that irritate your lungs with every breath, that get into your eyes and nose and throat, that make breathing itself painful and difficult. For humans living in these regions, it was a death sentence, swift and final. Most populations simply vanished within months or years. They couldn't migrate fast enough to escape the affected zones because they didn't know which direction to go, didn't know where conditions might be better. They couldn't adapt because there was nothing to adapt to, no food sources to exploit, no survival strategies that could work when everything is buried under meters of ash. They ran out of food and starved to death. Or they died from respiratory problems caused by breathing ash-filled air day after day, or they succumbed to the cold as temperatures plummeted and they couldn't find adequate shelter or maintain fires. The populations of modern humans living in Southeast Asia were almost certainly completely wiped out. The humans who had spread into South Asia probably met similar fates. These weren't small populations either. These were potentially tens of thousands of people, successful human groups that had been thriving in these regions for thousands of years, gone within a generation. But even regions far from the eruption, regions that didn't get buried under meters of ash, suffered terribly. The volcanic winter was global. The ash in the upper atmosphere circled the entire planet, affecting climate everywhere. The effects were less severe the farther you got from the eruption, but they were still catastrophic for populations living on the edge of survival, even in good times. The volcanic winter meant shorter growing seasons everywhere. Plants that needed certain amounts of sunlight to complete their life cycles couldn't do it anymore. Fruiting trees failed to produce fruit. Seed-bearing plants failed to produce seeds. The caloric availability of wild plant foods dropped dramatically. Colder temperatures killed plants that humans and animals had depended on for food. Species adapted to tropical or subtropical conditions couldn't survive when temperatures dropped 10 or 15 degrees. They died back, leaving huge regions with greatly reduced food availability. Reduced rainfall in some areas as climate patterns shifted and monsoons weakened. Rivers that had flowed year-round became seasonal. Streams dried up entirely. Lakes shrank or disappeared. Water sources that human groups had depended on for generations became unreliable or vanished. Increased storms and unpredictable weather in other regions as atmospheric circulation patterns went chaotic. The reliable seasonal patterns that humans had learned to predict and plan around were replaced by chaos. You couldn't predict when rains would come. You couldn't predict when temperatures would drop. You couldn't plan anything because the old rules no longer applied. For several years, maybe as long as a decade or even 2 decades according to some climate models, the entire planet's climate was completely disrupted. Normal patterns of temperature, rainfall, plant growth, animal migration, everything humans depended on were thrown into chaos. And for a species that lived on the edge of survival even in good times, even when conditions were stable and predictable, this was catastrophic. Scientists estimate that before Toba erupted, there might have been 100,000 or more modern humans scattered across Africa and parts of Asia. Some estimates go higher, suggesting perhaps 200,000 or even 300,000. The archaeological record is too sparse to know for certain, but genetic evidence and models of hunter-gatherer population densities suggest a reasonably healthy population of early modern humans spread across multiple regions and multiple continents. After the eruption and the volcanic winter that followed, that number crashed, hard and fast. Some estimates put the surviving population at as low as 1,000 breeding individuals. That's not total individuals, that's breeding individuals, people of reproductive age who could actually have children. The total population, including children and elderly, might have been 2,000 to 3,000 people total. Other estimates are slightly more generous but not much better, suggesting maybe 3,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals, perhaps 10,000 to 30,000 total people. But even the high estimates represent a catastrophic die-off. If you start with 100,000 people and end with 10,000, that's a 90% mortality rate. 9 out of every 10 people dead. If the low estimates are correct and the population dropped to 1,000 breeding individuals, that's a 99% die-off. 99 out of every 100 people gone. Think about that for a second. Really let it sink in. Imagine if 99% of everyone you knew just died within a few years. Your family, your friends, your neighbors, your community. Not just people dying of old age or accidents, but everybody dying because the world itself became uninhabitable. That's what happened to humanity 74,000 years ago. And we were the lucky ones, if you can call it luck. We were the species that barely survived. Most large mammal species in Africa and Asia during this period weren't so fortunate. They went extinct entirely, their populations reduced below the threshold needed for recovery, disappearing forever from the Earth. Now you might think, okay, so our ancestors went through a really terrible time. A volcanic eruption killed most humans. Populations crashed to nearly nothing. But they recovered. We're here. There are 8 billion of us now. What's the big deal? Species bounce back from population crashes all the time, right? Wrong. Completely wrong. That's not how population biology works. When populations get this small, they almost never recover. The mathematics of extinction are brutal, unforgiving, and extremely well understood. There are equations that predict with frightening accuracy when a population has dropped below the point of no return. With only 1,000 to 10,000 people left, scattered across who knows how much territory, humans were in what biologists call an extinction vortex. It's a technical term, but it describes something terrifyingly simple. When populations drop below a certain critical threshold, they enter a self-reinforcing death spiral that's almost impossible to escape. Each problem makes the next problem worse, and the problems compound until extinction becomes inevitable. Here's how it works, step by brutal step. First, genetic diversity plummets. This isn't just about having variety for its own sake. Genetic diversity is essential for a species' ability to adapt to challenges. With so few individuals, you lose genetic variations that might be critically important for surviving future diseases, future climate changes, future challenges that you can't even predict yet. The gene pool becomes shallow, limited, vulnerable. Second, inbreeding becomes inevitable. With only a few thousand people spread across an entire continent, your mating choices are severely limited. You end up partnering with relatives, close relatives, because there's nobody else available. Inbreeding brings recessive genetic disorders to the surface. Conditions that would be rare in a large, diverse population become common. Birth defects increase. Developmental problems become widespread. Fertility drops because genetic problems affect reproductive success. Third, you lose what geneticists call genetic load capacity. Every population carries some harmful mutations. In large populations, these are diluted and spread out enough that they don't cause major problems. But in small populations, harmful mutations become concentrated. They can't be diluted. They accumulate faster than natural selection can remove them. The overall fitness of the population declines generation by generation. Fourth, random chance becomes deadly. In a large population, if one group gets wiped out by a flood or a disease outbreak or a predator attack or any other localized disaster, the loss is tragic, but the population as a whole survives and continues. But in a population of just a few thousand individuals scattered across a vast continent, losing even one small group of 30 or 40 people represents a significant percentage of total genetic diversity, a measurable loss of accumulated knowledge, a real reduction in the species' chances of survival. A few bad years, a few unlucky disasters, a drought here and a disease outbreak there, and a predator attack somewhere else, and suddenly you're down from 3,000 people to 1,500. Then another round of bad luck brings you down to 750, then 400, then it's over. The population drops below the minimum viable threshold and extinction becomes inevitable even if nothing else goes wrong. Fifth, social structures break down when populations get too small. Humans are incredibly social animals. We need other people not just for reproduction, but for sharing knowledge, maintaining culture, cooperating on large tasks like hunting or building shelters or defending against predators or rivals. When populations get very small and groups are scattered far apart, finding mates becomes difficult. Maintaining trade networks becomes impossible. Knowledge gets lost when individuals die because there aren't enough people to pass it on to. There aren't enough minds to hold all the accumulated wisdom. The archaeological and ethnographic record shows that hunter-gatherer groups need minimum population densities to remain viable. Below about 500 people in a regional network, cultures start losing complex skills. Below about 200 people, even basic technologies can be lost. Isolated groups of 20 or 30 people can sometimes maintain survival skills for a few generations, but they inevitably lose complex knowledge over time. Sixth, what biologists call the alley effect kicks in. Below certain population densities, individuals have trouble finding mates, finding cooperation partners, finding anyone else at all. Reproduction rates drop not because of genetic problems, but simply because fertile adults can't find each other. This is particularly bad for a species like humans that has relatively long generation times. If it takes you 15 or 20 years to reach reproductive maturity, and then you have trouble finding a mate, and then you can only have a few offspring over your lifetime, population recovery becomes painfully slow, even if conditions improve. Most species that hit population numbers this low just disappear forever. The fossil record and the historical record are absolutely full of examples. Animals that were once abundant, reduced to tiny populations by climate change or disease or competition or habitat loss or human hunting, unable to recover, slowly fading into extinction even when the original crisis has passed. Passenger pigeons once numbered in the billions, literally darkening the skies when they flew in their massive flocks. But when their populations were reduced below critical thresholds by hunting and habitat loss, they couldn't recover. The last passenger pigeon died in 1914, less than 100 years after the species was still abundant. The thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, was reduced to tiny populations and went extinct despite protection efforts. The last known individual died in 1936. Countless other species have followed the same pattern. Once populations drop below critical thresholds, extinction becomes likely or inevitable even if conditions improve and even if humans try to help. But somehow, impossibly, humans didn't disappear. Somehow we held on. Somehow a tiny population of modern humans, scattered across Africa in small, vulnerable groups, kept the flame of humanity alive when it should have been extinguished by any reasonable prediction of population biology. This is the part of the story that still amazes scientists today. Not that Toba nearly killed us. That makes perfect sense, given what we know about the eruption and its effects, but that we survived anyway, that we held on through years, decades, possibly centuries of conditions that should have finished us off, that we not only survived, but eventually recovered and thrived and became the most successful large mammal species on the planet. How? What did these survivors have that other human populations lacked? What made them special? What allowed them to thread the needle of the extinction vortex when almost every other species in similar circumstances has failed? The genetic evidence drawn from analyzing the DNA of thousands of people from populations all over the world suggests that the population that survived the bottleneck was primarily located in Africa, not the regions of Asia closest to Toba, which were devastated beyond any hope of survival and likely saw complete extinction of human populations within months of the eruption. But Africa, far enough from the eruption zone to avoid the worst of the ashfall, but still severely affected by the volcanic winter and the global climate disruption that followed. These survivors weren't concentrated in one location. They couldn't have been. That would violate every principle of evolutionary survival strategy. Basic population biology and evolutionary theory tell us that putting all your eggs in one basket, concentrating your entire species in one vulnerable location, is a guaranteed recipe for extinction. One localized disaster, one drought or flood or disease outbreak or volcanic event or asteroid impact or any of 1,000 other possible catastrophes, and everyone dies. Natural selection operating over millions of years doesn't allow species to make mistakes that obvious. So the survivors were scattered across the landscape, probably in small groups of 20 to 50 people. Extended families where everyone was related to everyone else within just a few generations, where you knew every person in your group intimately because your survival depended on cooperation with all of them. These groups were spread across favorable locations in Africa, probably hundreds of miles apart from each other, connected by occasional contact and trade and marriage exchanges, but living independently enough that no single disaster could wipe them all out simultaneously. But where exactly? What specific locations? What made these refugees special enough that humans could survive there when they died out everywhere else? Scientists have spent decades trying to answer these questions, looking for clues in the archaeological record, in climate data, in genetic evidence, in studies of modern ecosystems. The answers are still incomplete, but a picture has emerged. The survivors almost certainly lived near reliable water sources. When the climate goes completely insane and normal patterns of rainfall become unpredictable or fail entirely and everything around you is dying from drought, water becomes the single most precious resource in existence. More valuable than food, more valuable than shelter, more valuable than anything else, because without water you die within days. A spring that keeps flowing when rivers dry up. A lake fed by deep aquifers that doesn't disappear during extended droughts. An underground water source that maintains flow even when rainfall drops to almost nothing for years at a time. A river that originates in mountains that still get enough precipitation to maintain base flow. These become life rafts in a dying world, islands of survival in an ocean of death. Water means animals come to drink, even when there's barely any food available. Even when populations are stressed and reduced. Animals need water more desperately than food. They'll travel from far away to reach reliable water sources. And animals coming to drink means you can hunt. You can set up ambush points near water sources. You can track animals to and from watering holes. You can predict their movements. And if you can hunt, if you can get protein and fat from animal prey, you have a much better chance of surviving than groups that depend entirely on plant foods that have become scarce or disappeared entirely. The humans who found these oases, who recognized their critical value, who claimed them and defended them against other humans or large predators, those are the ones who made it through the crisis. But water alone wasn't enough. You needed more than just a reliable spring or lake. You needed knowledge accumulated over generations about how to survive in harsh conditions. You needed skills that took years to learn and lifetimes to master. You needed technologies that other human populations might have lacked or never developed. And most importantly, you needed something that's much harder to quantify but absolutely essential for survival in small groups: social cohesion. When you're down to 20 or 30 people in your group, when your entire extended family fits around a single large fire, everyone matters. Every single person represents irreplaceable value. Each adult carries unique knowledge and skills. Each child represents the future. Each elderly person holds wisdom accumulated over decades. Lose one productive adult to an accident during a hunt, or to disease, or to violence, and you've lost accumulated knowledge about tracking animals, or identifying plants, or finding water, or making tools. You've lost valuable skills that took years to develop. You've lost genetic diversity that makes your group more resilient to future challenges. Your group is measurably weaker, measurably more vulnerable, measurably less likely to survive the next crisis. Lose several people in a short time period to disease or accidents or any other cause, and your entire group might not survive. You might not have enough adults to successfully hunt large game. You might not have enough people to maintain a fire watch all night to keep predators away. You might not have enough genetic diversity to avoid the worst effects of inbreeding. You might cross below that invisible threshold where group viability collapses. So these survivors, these ancestors of every human alive today, they developed cooperation skills that would seem almost superhuman by modern standards. They learned to share resources with a generosity that seems almost irrational, especially when resources were desperately scarce, and you might have had good reason to hoard what little you had. They learned to resolve disputes without violence because they literally could not afford to lose anyone to fighting, couldn't afford injuries that would reduce someone's ability to contribute, couldn't afford the grudges and divisions that conflict creates in small groups. They learned to care for the sick and injured instead of abandoning them to die, because every person represented value to the group's survival, even if they couldn't contribute physically at the moment. Most importantly for our purposes, most critically for understanding how humanity survived, they learned to share knowledge with an intensity and thoroughness that probably has no parallel in the modern world. This wasn't generosity or kindness in the way we usually think about those concepts. This was pure survival strategy, rational behavior driven by desperate circumstances. When one person discovered a new food source, a patch of tubers that could be dug up and eaten, a tree that was producing fruit, a location where certain animals gathered, everyone in the group learned about it immediately. Not eventually, not when it came up in conversation, but immediately. That same day, that same hour, if possible, because if only one person knew where food could be found and that person died before passing on the information, everyone else might starve. When someone figured out a new hunting technique that improved success rates even slightly, a better way to track animals or approach prey or coordinate group hunts, that knowledge spread through the group within days. Everyone needed to learn it because improving hunting success by even a few percentage points could mean the difference between the group surviving or slowly starving over the course of a harsh season. When someone developed a better way to make tools, a technique for producing sharper stone blades or more durable wooden spears or more effective baskets for carrying gathered foods, that innovation had to be transmitted to everyone. You couldn't afford to have your best toolmaker be the only person who knew the technique, because if they died unexpectedly, the entire group's technological level would drop. When elders had wisdom accumulated over decades of observation, knowledge about reading weather patterns or predicting seasonal changes or finding water during different types of drought or understanding animal behavior, that knowledge was passed down with an intensity that probably resembled religious reverence. Elderly people who could no longer hunt or gather effectively were still incredibly valuable because they held information that could save lives. They were walking libraries of survival knowledge, and losing them without fully transferring what they knew to the next generation was a catastrophe. This created what anthropologists and archaeologists call a hypercultural survival strategy. Most animals survive primarily through biological adaptations that are passed down genetically from parents to offspring. Thick fur for cold climates encoded in DNA, sharp claws for catching prey built into the structure of the body, ability to digest certain foods determined by genetics. These adaptations are reliable because they're automatic, but they're also slow to change because biological evolution operates on timescales of thousands or millions of years. Humans survive primarily through cultural adaptations that are passed down through teaching and learning, through demonstration and practice, through stories and explanations. How to make fire, which has to be learned. Where to find water in different seasons, which requires accumulated knowledge. Which plants are safe to eat and which are poisonous, which must be taught. How to track and hunt animals, which takes years of practice and instruction. These cultural adaptations can change quickly, can adapt to new circumstances within a single generation, but they're also fragile because they depend on successful transmission from one generation to the next. During the bottleneck period, this cultural transmission became absolutely critical for survival. Groups that were good at teaching and learning, that had effective methods for passing knowledge between generations, that maintained their accumulated wisdom even when times were desperate, those groups survived. Groups that lost knowledge, that failed to teach the next generation effectively, that let crucial information die with individuals, those groups disappeared. This created intense selection pressure for the cognitive abilities that support culture, intelligence in the practical sense of being able to learn complex skills quickly, memory for retaining large amounts of information about plants, animals, locations, techniques, patterns, teaching ability for effectively passing knowledge to others. Social intelligence for maintaining the group cooperation that made knowledge sharing possible. Children weren't just raised in the sense of being fed and protected until they could fend for themselves. They were intensively educated from the moment they could understand language, maybe even before, in a constant immersive process of learning everything the adults knew. Not in the formal sense we think of education today, with schools and curricula and grades and structured lessons, but in a total immersion where children were constantly exposed to adult activities, constantly watching and listening and practicing and being corrected and trying again, where to find water in each season, which directions to travel when the usual sources dry up, what signs in the landscape indicate underground water, how to dig wells in dry stream beds. Which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous, what they looked like in different seasons, how to process toxic plants to make them edible, how to store plant foods for lean times, how to track animals, reading signs in soil and vegetation, interpreting behavior, predicting movements, how to predict weather changes, reading clouds and wind patterns, knowing when storms were coming or when droughts would break. How to make and maintain tools, selecting proper stones, striking them at the right angles, creating effective cutting edges, attaching points to shafts. How to start and maintain fires in wet conditions, in wind, with limited materials. Everything. Children who learned quickly, who paid attention, who retained information well, who could apply knowledge in new situations, they had measurably better survival chances than children who were slower learners. And survival chances translated directly into reproduction chances, into passing on not just cultural knowledge, but the genetic capacity for learning efficiently. Over hundreds of generations, over thousands of years of bottleneck conditions, this created intense selection pressure for human intelligence. Not just raw IQ in the abstract sense measured by modern tests, but practical intelligence, problem-solving ability, memory capacity, pattern recognition, the ability to learn complex skills quickly from observation and instruction, social intelligence for reading other people's intentions and cooperating effectively with them, teaching teaching ability for passing on knowledge to the next generation. The humans who emerged from the bottleneck after thousands of years of this selection pressure weren't just survivors in the sense of being lucky, they were refined, sharpened, optimized by natural selection, operating at maximum intensity for exactly the cognitive abilities that would later allow humans to dominate the planet. Fire was everything during this period. Humans had been using fire for hundreds of thousands of years by 70,000 years ago, but during the volcanic winter and the climate chaos that followed, fire transcended being merely useful and became the absolute difference between life and death. Fire kept you warm when global temperatures dropped by 5 or 10 or 15 degrees depending on your location. This sounds obvious, but it's critically important to understand. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, don't have thick fur like other mammals. We don't have layers of insulating fat like seals or whales. We're adapted for warm climates, for tropical and subtropical Africa where we evolved. Our thermoregulation strategy depends on sweating for cooling, which works great when it's hot, but leaves us vulnerable to cold. When temperatures plummeted during the volcanic winter, humans without reliable access to fire simply froze to death, especially at night when temperatures dropped lowest. The groups that survived were the ones that had mastered fire completely, that could maintain fires constantly, that could create fire reliably even in adverse conditions with wet materials or strong winds, that could transport fire when moving camp, that treated fire as a member of the group that had to be constantly tended and never allowed to die. Fire let you cook food, which fundamentally changed everything about human diet and survival strategies. Cooking meat makes it dramatically safer to eat, killing parasites and bacteria and other pathogens that could wipe out your entire group through disease outbreaks. In a time when populations were desperately small and couldn't afford losses, preventing disease was just as important as finding food. More importantly, cooking breaks down tough proteins and cell walls, making nutrients more bioavailable, allowing your digestive system to extract more calories from the same amount of food. When food is desperately scarce and you're barely getting enough calories to survive, this efficiency gain could literally mean the difference between slow starvation over months and managing to hang on until conditions improved. Cooking plants was even more revolutionary than cooking meat. Many roots and tubers that are completely indigestible or even toxic when raw become major sources of carbohydrates when properly cooked. The heat breaks down toxins, softens tough fibers, converts complex starches into forms your body can process. During the bottleneck, when traditional food sources had disappeared or become scarce, this ability to process previously inedible plants into calorie sources might have been what kept some groups alive when others starved. Fire kept predators away during the night, creating a safe zone around human camps. This mattered more than most people realize. When human populations crashed to tiny numbers, when groups shrank to 20 or 30 individuals, we became much more vulnerable to predation than when we lived in larger bands. In better times, groups of 50 or 100 humans could actively drive away or even hunt and kill large predators that threatened them. But a group of 20 people sleeping in the open is attractive prey to lions or hyenas or leopards or other large carnivores. Fire was the barrier that let humans sleep safely, that created a perimeter that predators instinctively avoided, that gave vulnerable groups of sleeping humans a fighting chance against nocturnal predators. Without fire, groups camping in the open would have suffered regular losses to predator attacks, losses they couldn't afford. Most critically, fire extended the usable day beyond sunset, creating hours of productive time that would otherwise be lost to darkness. Without artificial light, humans are largely helpless after the sun goes down. Our eyes aren't adapted for night vision like cats or owls. We can't hunt in darkness. We can't effectively gather plant foods. We can't work on complex tasks that require seeing details. Most animals either hunt after dark if they're predators with good night vision, or hide after dark if they're prey animals trying to avoid those predators. The night belongs to creatures with adaptations we lack. Humans without fire are essentially disabled for 12 hours out of every 24. But with fire, humans could remain active and productive after sunset. You could work on tools by firelight, carefully shaping stone blades or straightening wooden spear shafts or repairing baskets and containers. You could process and prepare food, cooking what you'd gathered during the day, preparing materials for the next day's activities. You could repair clothing and weapons, maintaining the equipment that kept you alive. And most importantly, you could gather together as a group and engage in the social activities that maintained group cohesion and transmitted culture. You could talk, sharing information about where food had been found, where animal tracks had been seen, what signs suggested weather changes. You could tell stories, passing down knowledge from older generations, teaching children about dangers and opportunities, maintaining the oral traditions that preserved crucial survival information. You could teach skills that required demonstration and practice, showing children and young adults how to make tools properly, how to track animals effectively, how to read landscapes, and predict where resources would be found. You could maintain and strengthen social bonds through conversation and shared activities, bonds that were essential for the cooperation that kept your group alive. These hours after sunset, gathered around fires, protected from cold and predators and darkness, became the time and space where human culture was transmitted, refined, expanded, and preserved across generations. Without fire, human cultural evolution would have been dramatically limited. With fire, humans could maintain and build on accumulated knowledge in ways no other species could match. The archaeological evidence from the bottleneck period is frustratingly sparse, maddeningly incomplete. Not because nothing significant was happening, not because humans weren't doing interesting things, but because there were so few humans that very little material evidence was left behind. And what little was left has been buried, eroded, destroyed, or simply hasn't been found yet after 74,000 years. With only a few thousand people spread across vast territories, possibly across multiple continents, the chances of finding their artifacts or remains is vanishingly small. It's like trying to find specific grains of sand on an endless beach. Actually, it's worse than that. It's like trying to find specific grains of sand on a beach when you don't know which beach to search, and the grains you're looking for have been buried under 70,000 years of geological processes, shifted by erosion, covered by sediment, destroyed by natural forces. But what little evidence we do have is fascinating and suggestive. Stone tools from this period show increasing sophistication and standardization, not radical revolutionary changes, not sudden appearance of completely new technologies, but clear refinement and improvement. The tools are better made, more carefully shaped, more effective for their intended purposes. The people who survived the bottleneck were the best toolmakers, the most skilled craftspeople, the best problem solvers. They had to be. Being second best meant your group died out and your genes didn't get passed on. More interestingly, there's evidence from archaeological sites of long-distance movement of materials, suggesting that despite the catastrophe, despite being reduced to tiny populations scattered across vast distances, humans were maintaining some kind of contact and communication network. Obsidian, volcanic glass prized for its ability to hold extremely sharp edges, found hundreds of kilometers from its source locations. This means someone carried it that far, either through direct travel or through trade exchanges between groups. Shells from coastal areas found in inland archaeological sites, sometimes hundreds of miles from any ocean. Ochre, a mineral pigment that produces red and yellow colors used for decoration and possibly ritual purposes, transported across vast distances from the limited locations where high-quality ochre could be obtained. This evidence of long-distance material movement suggests something remarkable and counterintuitive. The scattered human groups weren't completely isolated from each other. Despite being reduced to populations that barely numbered in the thousands, despite living in small, vulnerable groups, separated by hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, despite barely hanging on to survival and having every reason to focus only on immediate needs, humans were maintaining connections, maintaining trade relationships, maintaining some kind of social network. This makes perfect sense from a survival and evolutionary perspective once you think about it. With populations this small, you absolutely cannot afford complete isolation. The mathematics of small population genetics make this clear. You need to exchange marriage partners with other groups regularly to avoid the worst effects of inbreeding. If your group of 30 people only married within itself for generation after generation, genetic problems would accumulate rapidly. Children would increasingly suffer from recessive genetic disorders. Fertility would drop. Birth defects would become common. Within just a few generations, your group would be so genetically compromised that survival would become nearly impossible. But if you maintain contact with other groups, if you arrange marriages between groups, if young adults from your group partner with young adults from other groups several days travel away, you maintain genetic diversity. You avoid the worst inbreeding effects. You give your descendants a much better chance of being healthy and fertile. You also need to share information about where resources can be found, which regions are experiencing droughts, where game animals have migrated, which areas should be avoided due to disease or dangerous predators or hostile groups. This information exchange could be the difference between life and death. If your group's territory experiences a severe drought, but you know through your network that a region a week's travel away still has reliable water, you can migrate. If you don't have that information, your group might stay in place and die of thirst. You need potential allies in case your own territory becomes uninhabitable, and you need to relocate or need help dealing with threats. You need the possibility of refuge if disaster strikes your group. You need the social insurance that a network provides. So despite the catastrophe, despite being reduced to the very edge of extinction, humans maintained connections between groups. They visited each other, probably on seasonal schedules, gathering at particular locations at particular times of year. They traded goods, not just for the material value, but as a way of maintaining relationships. They shared stories and knowledge and news. They arranged marriages between groups, probably with considerable negotiation and ceremony. They maintained the social network that provided resilience against disasters. This network created what population biologists and ecologists call a metapopulation structure, a term that sounds technical but describes a simple and powerful survival strategy. Instead of one single population that would be vulnerable to any localized disaster, you have multiple semi-independent populations connected by occasional migration and genetic exchange. Individual groups within the metapopulation rise and fall, flourish and fail, even go completely extinct and disappear. Some groups find good territories with reliable resources and thrive for a generation or two, growing to 50 or 60 people. Other groups face droughts or disease or accidents or predation and dwindle, dropping to 15 or 10 people before recovering if they're lucky. Some groups fail completely, dying out entirely when disasters overwhelm them. But as long as some groups survive somewhere in the network, as long as successful groups occasionally send out migrants who join struggling groups or establish new groups in empty territories, as long as the connections between groups are maintained, the metapopulation as a whole can persist even when individual components fail. It's like a game where individual players keep getting eliminated, but new players keep entering from a reserve pool, so the game itself continues indefinitely, even though specific players come and go. The network has redundancy, resilience, the ability to absorb losses that would be fatal to a single isolated population. This meta-population structure probably saved humanity. If humans had been one isolated population of 1,000 individuals concentrated in a single region, we almost certainly would have gone extinct. One more disaster, one disease outbreak or drought or flood or volcanic event or any of countless possible catastrophes, and everyone dies. Game over. No more humans. Ever. But as a network of small groups spread across favorable locations, connected by occasional contact but independent enough that no single disaster could destroy everyone simultaneously, humanity had resilience. Multiple chances. Redundancy. When one group failed, others survived elsewhere. When one region became uninhabitable, humans persisted in other regions. When genetic diversity dropped dangerously low in one group, marriages with other groups replenished it. It was a desperate survival strategy, constantly on the edge of failure, always vulnerable. But it worked. Barely, but it worked. Now let's talk about what daily life was actually like during this period. Because it's easy to discuss population genetics and survival strategies and meta-population structures in abstract terms, but these were real people, living real lives, facing real hardships every single day. Your daily routine during the bottleneck would have been brutally simple and endlessly repetitive. Wake up with the sun, find water, find food, don't get killed, try to stay warm and dry. Maintain your tools and weapons, then sleep and repeat the whole process tomorrow. Do this every single day until you die, hopefully after having children who can continue the cycle. Water came first, always. Before food, before anything else. In a world where most streams ran dry for part of the year or longer, where rainfall had become erratic and unpredictable, where drought could last for years, knowing where to find reliable water sources meant the literal difference between life and death within days. These survivors probably developed abilities that would seem almost supernatural to modern humans. The ability to read landscapes with incredible precision, spotting subtle signs of underground water that we would completely miss. Noticing how certain plants grew only where groundwater was relatively close to the surface. Observing how animals behaved and where they traveled, following them to water sources. Remembering vast mental maps of where springs emerged during different seasons, which streams flowed longest into dry periods, where pools might retain water in rock formations even when everything else dried up. They might have learned to dig wells, primitive ones by modern standards, but effective enough. Holes scraped out with digging sticks and stones in dry stream beds where water tables were accessible. Nothing sophisticated, no brick linings or mechanical pumps, just depressions dug deep enough to reach groundwater and allow it to slowly seep into a pool where it could be scooped out. Even a crude well that reached groundwater could sustain a family group through a dry season, could mean the difference between survival and dying of thirst. Food was harder than water, required more time, more energy, more skill, more luck. With most large game animals extinct or severely reduced in numbers, with plant foods unpredictable due to climate chaos, you couldn't rely on the strategies your ancestors had used. You became what anthropologists call dietary generalists or broad-spectrum foragers, which is academic language for saying you ate absolutely everything you could possibly digest without dying. Insects, Always insects when nothing else was available. Termites pulled from their mounds. Crickets and grasshoppers caught by hand or in simple traps. Beetle larvae dug from rotting wood. This sounds disgusting by modern cultural standards, but insects are actually remarkably nutritious food sources. Pound for pound, many insects provide more protein than beef or fish. They contain good fats and essential vitamins. They reproduce quickly, so populations can be harvested repeatedly without being depleted, and they're available year-round in tropical and subtropical regions. You ate roots and tubers dug from the ground, anything that grew underground where it was protected from temperature extremes and drought conditions that killed surface plants. You learned through careful observation and probably some deaths from poisoning which species were edible during different seasons, which ones were toxic unless properly prepared by cooking or leaching, which ones could be stored for weeks or months as insurance against future food shortages. You became an expert at finding eggs, checking bird nests and reptile egg-laying sites, bird eggs, reptile eggs, anything that contained protein and fat. You learned to follow certain animals to their nesting grounds, learned the timing of breeding seasons, learned to raid nests for maximum yield while leaving enough eggs that breeding populations could recover and you could harvest again next season. Small game animals whenever you could catch them, rodents, rabbits, small antelopes, anything you could trap or hunt, not the magnificent coordinated hunts of large dangerous prey that your ancestors might have conducted, not bringing down buffalo or wild cattle or elephants, but desperate opportunistic scavenging and hunting for whatever small parcels of meat you could get. And occasionally, when you got very lucky or very skilled or both, you found larger meat sources. A young antelope that got separated from its herd and couldn't keep up. An animal injured by predators or accidents that you could track and kill. An elderly or sick individual dying of disease or thirst that you could scavenge before other scavengers found it. You took absolutely anything you could get because meat meant protein and fat meant calories that could keep you alive through lean times. This is where fire and cooking became absolutely essential and non-optional. Raw meat from scavenged carcasses could be full of parasites, bacteria, viruses, all kinds of pathogens that could cause disease outbreaks that would kill your entire group. Cooking made it safer, killed the dangerous organisms, gave you a much better chance of eating without getting deadly sick, and cooking made tough, old, partially decomposed meat digestible when fresh kills weren't available. It broke down connective tissues and proteins, made nutrients accessible to your digestive system, allowed you to extract calories from materials that would be nearly useless raw. But here's what really strikes me as remarkable about this period. What really captures something essential about human nature that still defines us today. Despite everything, despite barely surviving, despite living on the very edge of extinction with death constantly lurking just days away, humans found the capacity for something beyond mere survival, something that transcended the desperate scramble for food and water and shelter. Around 70,000 years ago, right around when the bottleneck was at its absolute worst, when conditions were most desperate, we see the first clear and unambiguous evidence of symbolic thought and artistic behavior in the archaeological record. Pieces of ochre with geometric patterns carved into them deliberately, patterns that serve no functional purpose, that are purely decorative or symbolic. Shell beads clearly manufactured for personal decoration, pierced and shaped and worn, serving no survival function but carrying social or aesthetic meaning. Possible early examples of cave art, though dating these is uncertain and controversial. This is the birth of culture as we recognize it today. Article, symbolism, beauty, the ability to create meaning beyond immediate practical needs. And it happened during humanity's darkest hour, during the worst crisis our species has ever faced, when we were down to a few thousand people clinging desperately to existence in scattered refuges, when finding enough food to survive another day should have been literally the only thing that mattered, the only thing anyone had energy or time or resources for. Somehow, some way, humans found the capacity for beauty and meaning, for creating things that served no practical survival purpose, but made life worth living, for decoration and art and symbolism. Think about that. Really think about what it means. Your ancestors were starving. They were watching friends and family members die from disease and starvation and accidents. They were barely hanging on by their fingernails to survival itself. Every calorie was precious. Every moment of daylight needed to be spent on survival tasks. And they made art anyway. They created jewelry. They decorated their tools and their bodies. They maintained culture and meaning, even when maintaining biological life itself required every ounce of energy and resourcefulness they could muster. That's humanity. That's what separates us from every other species that has ever existed. When things get desperate, when survival itself is in question, we don't just survive if we can. We find ways to make survival meaningful. We create beauty in the midst of horror. We maintain hope and culture and art when hope seems completely irrational and art seems like an unaffordable luxury. We are not just survivors, we are meaning makers, storytellers, artists. Even in the darkest times, especially in the darkest times, we insist that life must be more than just not dying. But I don't want to romanticize this too much. Most of the time, for most people, life during the bottleneck wasn't beautiful or meaningful or artistic. It was brutal. It was grinding poverty and constant hunger and endless fear. It was wake up, find food if you can, find water, try desperately not to die today. Repeat every single day until you finally do die. Hopefully after raising a few children who might survive long enough to continue the pattern. Infant and child mortality must have been absolutely horrific, heartbreaking beyond what most modern people can imagine. In contemporary hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists, roughly 40 to 50% of children don't survive to adulthood, even in relatively good conditions. During the bottleneck, with populations stressed by malnutrition and disease and harsh environmental conditions, the numbers were almost certainly worse. Maybe only 1 child in 3 lived to reproduce, maybe fewer. Parents watched children die from starvation, from disease, from accidents, from exposure, from any of 100 causes that modern medicine could easily prevent or treat. The grief must have been crushing, omnipresent, a constant background reality of life. Childbirth itself was desperately dangerous for mothers. Without modern medical knowledge or interventions, complications during delivery could easily be fatal. Hemorrhaging, infections, obstructed labor, any number of problems could kill. Women who survived multiple births, who successfully delivered several living children, were valuable beyond measure to their groups because they could produce the next generation even when so many others died trying. Infections from minor wounds could and did kill regularly. Cut your hand on a stone tool while working, get it dirty with soil bacteria, develop an infection that spreads, and you could be dead within a week or 2 from blood poisoning. No antibiotics, no antiseptics, no medical interventions of any kind. Just your immune system and luck standing between a small injury and death. Accidents during hunts or while traveling could cripple or kill. Tracking a wounded animal into thick vegetation, You could be gored or trampled. Trying to bring down even small game could result in injuries that became infected, falling while climbing to reach bird nests or fruit in trees, snake bites, encounters with large predators. The world was full of dangers. The average lifespan, if you survived the gauntlet of childhood, was probably 30 to 40 years. If you made it to 50, you were elderly by the standards of the time, beginning to suffer the aches and limitations of age. If you made it to 60, you were ancient, a walking repository of knowledge and experience, incredibly valuable to your group for your accumulated wisdom, but also increasingly unable to contribute physically to hunts or long foraging expeditions. And the diet was rough, monotonous, barely adequate. You ate whatever you could get whenever you could get it. During relatively good times, maybe you had some variety, some meat and some plant foods and some insects and some eggs. During bad times, which were probably most times, you ate whatever didn't actively kill you. Roots that were barely digestible and left you feeling sick. Plants that were bitter and unpleasant but provided calories, insects when nothing else could be found. The volcanic winter and the climate chaos it triggered had devastated or destroyed food sources that humans had relied on for thousands of years. Animal species went extinct, plant species disappeared from large regions. Others migrated to distant areas where conditions were better, following climate zones as they shifted. The reliable patterns your ancestors had known and depended on were simply gone. The humans who survived were the ones who could adapt to these new realities, who could figure out how to eat foods they'd never eaten before, who could track and hunt animals they'd never hunted, who could identify new plant species as edible or poisonous through careful testing and observation, probably with some fatal mistakes along the way, who could go longer without eating when necessary, whose bodies were efficient at extracting and storing every possible calorie from whatever could be found. We carry the evolutionary legacy of this desperate time in our bodies today, written into our genes and physiology. Humans are remarkably, almost uniquely good at storing fat when food is available. Better than we need to be for modern life, where most people have reliable access to calories every single day. Better than makes sense for contemporary existence. That's because during the bottleneck, and for most of human evolutionary history, the humans who could efficiently pack on weight during good times had a critical buffer that kept them alive during famines and food shortages. The people who couldn't store fat efficiently, whose metabolisms burned through calories without building reserves, they died during the inevitable lean years. Their genes didn't get passed on to future generations. Today, we call this metabolic efficiency a problem, an obesity epidemic, a health crisis. We have trouble maintaining healthy weights in a world of food abundance, but this trait that causes modern health problems was absolutely essential for survival 70,000 years ago. The exact adaptation that kept your ancestors alive makes their descendants vulnerable to metabolic disorders in a world of plenty. The same principle applies to our intense cravings for sugar and fat. These macronutrients are everywhere in modern industrial societies, cheap and abundant in processed foods. But for 99% of human evolutionary history, concentrated sources of sugar and fat were incredibly rare and valuable. A honeycomb full of sugar and fat represented more calories than you might obtain in an entire week of normal foraging. A fatty animal kill was cause for celebration because such opportunities were uncommon. Your body learned through millions of years of evolution to crave these rare, valuable substances intensely, to seek them out obsessively when available, to consume them to excess and store what you couldn't immediately use, because the humans who didn't have these powerful cravings often starved during harsh times when only high-calorie foods provided enough energy for survival. Every seemingly maladaptive quirk of human biology and psychology makes more sense, becomes more comprehensible. when you realize we're fundamentally designed for a world of scarcity rather than abundance. A world where the next meal wasn't guaranteed. A world where finding high-calorie foods could mean the difference between your children living or starving. A world where 1,000 people were all that stood between humanity and permanent extinction. So how long did this bottleneck period last? How many years or centuries or millennia did humanity teeter on the edge of the abyss before beginning the slow climb back towards stable populations and eventual recovery? The genetic evidence drawn from analyzing DNA sequences and mutation rates in populations around the world suggests the bottleneck lasted for several thousand years minimum. The initial population crash from Toba and the volcanic winter it triggered probably killed the vast majority of humans within just a few years, maybe a decade at most. That was the acute crisis, the catastrophic die-off. But the recovery took dramatically, painfully longer. Population numbers stayed critically low, dangerously close to extinction thresholds, for perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 years after the initial disaster, according to most genetic analyses. Some studies suggest it might have been even longer, with human populations remaining below 20,000 individuals for 15,000 years or more, multiple millennia of barely hanging on. Why so long? Why couldn't humans bounce back quickly once the volcanic winter ended and conditions began to improve? Why did recovery take thousands of years instead of a few generations? Because the world that existed before Toba was gone, fundamentally altered, never to return in the same form. The volcanic winter had ended after a decade or two, but it had triggered longer-term changes in climate patterns and ecosystems that persisted for millennia. The Earth's climate had shifted into a new configuration. Ecosystems that had existed stably for thousands of years had been massively disrupted or destroyed entirely. Plant and animal communities had been torn apart. Many species had gone extinct and weren't coming back, leaving permanent holes in food webs. The animals humans had hunted for generations, species they knew intimately, weren't there anymore. The plants humans had gathered, species they could identify and process, were gone from large regions or had been replaced by unfamiliar species. Humans had to essentially rebuild their entire way of life from scratch in a world that operated by new rules. Figure out which of the new or newly dominant plant species were safe to eat and which were poisonous. Learn through trial and error, probably with fatal mistakes. Track where surviving animal populations had migrated or where new animal species had moved into empty niches. Adapt to altered climate patterns that shifted rainfall and temperature in ways that broke all the traditional knowledge about seasonal cycles and resource availability. All of this while maintaining populations that were too small to be truly stable or sustainable in the long term. Always just one more disaster away from complete extinction, always vulnerable to disease outbreaks that could wipe out entire groups, always at risk from droughts or floods or any of countless other catastrophes that could finish what Toba started. It's honestly miraculous that we made it through it all. The mathematical odds and biological principles were stacked against us. Most species that experience population crashes this severe simply die out. The breeding population gets too small. Genetic diversity drops too low. Inbreeding depression accumulates. Random chance delivers one too many unlucky events in sequence. And that's it. Extinction. Another branch pruned from the tree of life. But humans had advantages that most species lack. We had culture, accumulated knowledge passed between generations through teaching and learning rather than just genetic inheritance. We had language that allowed complex communication of abstract ideas. We had teaching methods and learning abilities that let us transmit survival skills efficiently across generations. We had toolmaking capabilities that let us extend our physical abilities. We had fire that let us survive in environments that would otherwise kill us. Most importantly, we had each other. We had social bonds and cooperation and networks. Those scattered groups of 20 or 30 people weren't just surviving individually as isolated units. They were part of a larger network, a web of relationships and alliances and occasional contact that made the whole system more resilient than any individual component. When one group struggled desperately, others might share resources or take in refugees or provide assistance. When one region became temporarily uninhabitable due to drought or disease or other localized disasters, people could migrate to where other groups had found relative stability. When one group made a technological breakthrough or discovered a new food source or developed a better survival technique, that knowledge could spread through the network over time, raising everyone's chances. The whole metapopulation system was more robust, more resilient, more capable of absorbing shocks than any single isolated group could be. And that network resilience is probably what ultimately saved humanity from extinction. Then, around 65,000 to 60,000 years ago, according to the genetic and archaeological evidence, something fundamental changed. The climate began to stabilize after millennia of chaos. Rainfall patterns became somewhat more predictable, temperature extremes began to moderate, plant and animal populations began to recover as ecosystems slowly rebuilt themselves into new, stable configurations. And human populations, after thousands of years of barely hanging on at critically low numbers, began to grow. Not slowly and gradually over tens of thousands of years, but relatively rapidly by evolutionary and demographic standards. Within just a few thousand years, a blink of an eye in evolutionary time, humans had spread beyond Africa in significant numbers for the first time. They crossed from northeastern Africa into the Middle East. They moved eastward into Asia. They reached Southeast Asia and then somehow crossed ocean barriers to reach Australia by around 50,000 years ago, which required sophisticated boat-building skills and navigation abilities. They moved westward and northward into Europe by around 45,000 years ago. This expansion out of Africa and across the globe wasn't just population growth and migration in the simple sense. It was a revolution. The humans who emerged from the bottleneck after thousands of years of the most intense natural selection imaginable weren't the same as the humans who entered it. They had been tested, refined, transformed. They were smarter, with enhanced cognitive abilities selected for by thousands of years, where being slightly more intelligent meant your children survived and less intelligent individuals' children didn't. More adaptable, with psychological flexibility selected for by rapidly changing and unpredictable conditions where rigid thinking meant death. More creative, with innovation ability selected for by constant new challenges that required new solutions. More capable of complex cooperation, with social skills selected for by tiny group sizes where cooperation was mandatory and conflict was fatal. They carried with them all the survival skills learned and refined during the crisis. All the technological innovations developed when innovation literally meant the difference between group survival and group extinction. All the social systems and cooperation methods refined through millennia of living in tiny, vulnerable groups where every person mattered and group cohesion was essential. They also carried genetic changes that had accumulated during the bottleneck period. Genes promoting intelligence and problem-solving abilities, genes facilitating language acquisition and complex communication. Genes enhancing social bonding and cooperation. Genes making humans uniquely adapted for survival through culture rather than just biology. When these post-bottleneck humans spread out of Africa and into the rest of the world, encountering new environments and new challenges, they weren't just another species of primate trying to eke out a marginal existence. They were something new, something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. They were modern humans in every sense that matters, with all the cognitive and cultural capacities that would eventually allow them to dominate the planet. And they proceeded to do exactly that, to conquer every terrestrial environment. To become the most successful large mammal species in Earth's history? Within 50,000 years of emerging from the bottleneck, humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. They had encountered and interbred with other human species like Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia. They had adapted to environments ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests to high-altitude mountains to remote island chains. They had developed sophisticated hunting technologies, including bows and arrows and atlatls, and complex coordinated hunting strategies. They had created art that still moves us emotionally tens of thousands of years later. By around 10,000 years ago, humans had independently developed agriculture in multiple locations around the world. Within another few thousand years, they had permanent settlements that grew into villages that grew into cities. They invented writing and mathematics and metallurgy and monumental architecture. They built civilizations that would have seemed like impossible fantasy to their bottleneck ancestors. They became us. And here's the part that should stop you in your tracks and make you really think. Everyone alive today, all 8 billion humans currently living on Earth, descends from those bottleneck survivors. Every single person reading or hearing this, every human who has lived at any point in the last 70,000 years, we are all children of those few thousand individuals who refused to give up when giving up would have been the rational response to utterly impossible circumstances. Your DNA contains sequences that survived Toba and the volcanic winter and thousands of years of near-extinction conditions. Genes that were tested more severely than any genes in any species have been tested before or since and proved themselves worthy of transmission to future generations. Every time your brain solves a problem cleverly, every time you cooperate with strangers to achieve shared goals, every time you learn something new and pass that knowledge to someone else, you're expressing behavioral patterns and cognitive abilities that were refined and selected for during humanity's darkest hour. So here we are, 8 billion humans everywhere, cities housing tens of millions, technologies connecting every corner of the planet instantly, art and science and culture beyond anything imaginable to previous generations. We've walked on the moon, we've mapped our own genome, we've built machines that can think, we've created medicines that cure diseases that once killed millions, we've constructed a global civilization. We are the children of survivors. Not metaphorically, literally, genetically, the inheritors of knowledge accumulated across thousands of generations, the products of natural selection so intense it nearly destroyed us completely, but instead forged us into something unprecedented. Every person alive carries the genetic signature of those few thousand individuals who looked at a world devastated by the largest volcanic eruption in human memory and decided to keep going, who survived when survival should have been mathematically, biologically, practically impossible, who held on to hope when hope was the most irrational thing in the universe. They made it through, they adapted, they multiplied, they spread across every continent, they became us. And if they could survive Toba, if they could survive the volcanic winter, if they could survive thousands of years balanced on the knife edge of extinction with their entire species reduced to numbers that would fit in a modern high school, then we can survive anything the future throws at us. The bottleneck is over. The recovery continues. The expansion never stopped. And the story of those 1,000 survivors is written in every cell of your body, in every neuron firing in your brain, in every moment when you solve a problem or cooperate with a stranger or teach something valuable to the next generation or create something beautiful or meaningful. You are the descendant of survivors, not just any survivors, but the ultimate survivors, people who were tested more severely than any humans before or since and passed that test. You carry their strength even if you've never had to use it. You carry their intelligence even if modern life doesn't demand it constantly. You carry their capacity for hope against impossible odds even if you've never faced impossible odds yourself. 74,000 years ago, it genuinely looked like the human story was ending. A supervolcano had erupted with unprecedented violence, ejecting enough material to bury entire states. The resulting volcanic winter had turned the global climate hostile. Human populations were dying out across multiple continents. Ecosystems were collapsing. Food sources were disappearing. A tiny, desperate group of survivors faced a world that seemed actively determined to kill them. They survived anyway. They refused to quit. They adapted to conditions that should have been unsurvivable. They cooperated when cooperation was the only strategy that could work. They persisted through thousands of years when extinction seemed inevitable. They slowly, painfully, impossibly recovered. They multiplied. They innovated. They spread across the entire world. They built everything we see around us today. They became us. And we carry forward their legacy every single day. We choose to keep going, to keep trying, to keep hoping, to keep building toward a future even when the present seems overwhelming or impossible. The 1,000 live on in us, not as metaphor or inspiration or abstract concept, but as literal genetic and cultural truth, written in our chromosomes, encoded in our DNA, expressed in our neural architecture, manifest in our capacity for resilience that still surprises us when we're truly tested. We are here, 8 billion strong, because roughly 1,000 people refused to give up 74,000 years ago, because they were tough enough and smart enough and cooperative enough and stubborn enough to keep hope alive until the world became livable again. And if they could do that with nothing but stone tools and fire and each other, we can do absolutely anything. The bottleneck is over, but its lessons remain forever. Stay adaptable, share knowledge freely, cooperate even when it's difficult. Never give up even when the odds seem impossible. Maintain hope even when hope seems irrational. Create meaning and beauty even in desperate times. Take care of each other because we're all we have. These are the principles that carried humanity through the worst disaster in our history, through conditions that should have ended our species permanently. They'll carry us through whatever comes next, because we are the descendants of the 1,000. We are the children of Toba. We are the heirs of survivors who refused to accept extinction. And here you are,